Hey everybody, let's take a look at HDR, merged HDR inside of Photoshop. I'll tell you right ahead of time, I don't use Photoshop's merge to HDR for my HDR work, but I want to do this video first because the program I really use is a third-party program and it costs about $100. I don't want to assume that everybody's going to go out and buy that program, so I at least want to show you that if you have Photoshop CS2, that you can do this inside of Photoshop. Alright, and then next week I'll do another video where I'll use the program called Photomatix Pro. I just think it does a better job. It's got more options, it's easier to use, and I think the results are way better. But we can do this inside Photoshop, and I want to show you how. I want to show you what you have access to right now. Alright, so to start this off, first let's look for some photos here. On the Mac, I want you to go to My Computer, your hard drive, your Applications folder, and then go find the Photoshop CS3 folder. On the PC, you're going to go to your C drive, go to Program Files, and then go to your Adobe Photoshop CS3 folder. And once you get there, so basically the same on the Mac and the PC at this point, you open up that Photoshop folder, go into the Samples folder, and after you go into Samples, you're going to see one called Merge to HDR. Alright, so I'm going to go ahead and double click that. And the whole deal here is HDR, high dynamic range. We get a higher dynamic range from shooting for HDR than we do with just one exposure, because you can see here we exposed for the shadows and then some of the midtones, and then we exposed for the highlights here. So we could not capture this whole scene in one photo to where we were able to expose for the shadows and expose for the highlights. Even though our eyes can see it, our eyes see it a different way. Our eyes see everything just fine, but our camera sees it differently. So we can use HDR photography to get the best of both worlds. So we start out by taking multiple exposures, alright, and just come select all these after you've taken them. One more thing, I got a tutorial at the end of the video where I'm going to show you about bracketing, or I've got a link at the end of the video where I'm going to show you about bracketing and a little bit about it, what it is and how you can set your camera up to take these photos. Alright, but for now, once you've got the photos, so you can go to this folder, this comes with Photoshop. You're going to go in Bridge, you're going to go to Tools, you're going to go down to the Photoshop menu, and you're going to go to Merge to HDR. And Photoshop is going to think for a moment. These are real high quality files, high resolution files, especially if you're shooting in RAW. And I do recommend, if you're going to be shooting HDR photography a lot, that you do shoot in RAW, because you get the widest range of tones and colors and everything in your photos. But you can shoot in JPEG if you want to. It's just RAW is going to give you a better end result. Now, once it's all done, and I'll tell you right now, if you're shooting in RAW, it takes a little bit longer than it does with JPEG to do this process, but you get this Merge to HDR dialog. At this point, you can look on the left-hand side, and you can turn off one of the options here, and you can see what your image looks like without using one of the different photos. But I gotta be honest with you, at this point, it's hard to make decisions in this dialog box, because this is really not where you end up. Alright, so it's really hard. You can move the slider around and things usually get really, really bad. Alright, so I don't make any decisions in here. The one thing I do choose is make sure that we have 32 bits per channel, and then I'm going to click OK. Now that is going to create the file, and this is going to take me into Photoshop with this huge 32-bit file. So even though at this point we don't see the information inside of our image, alright, even though we don't see all the information, it's there, alright, and we can start to pull it out by doing the HDR conversion, which we haven't done yet. Alright, and now you can see here, I mean, look at this. This is the reason why nobody uses Photoshop's Merge to HDR, because they think it stops here, and when you see this, you're like, why the heck would I use this? Alright, but it doesn't stop here. We go to Image, Mode, down to 16 bits per channel. This is going to open up the HDR conversion dialog, and here's where the magic happens. Right? You get these conversion methods and you have to pick one. I'm not going to spend time on the first three. Nobody really uses them. Exposure and gamma, kind of like brightness and contrast. Just try adjusting them and you'll see why you don't want to use it. Highlight compression. That's it. No controls, no nothing. If you like it, great. If you don't, you're stuck. Equalize histogram. A little bit better, but not much. Alright? And then the last one is local adaptation. Alright, and it looks bad now, but we're going to make it better. We're going to make it better by showing the curve in the histogram. And this is the only one of the conversion methods where we can come in here and we can start to move the curve around. In these other three, we can't move the curve around at all. Alright, so that's why everybody uses local adaptation. First thing I would do is just what I would do in levels. Take this slider, drag it over to where the black point would be in my levels, okay? And then do the same thing, drag this one over. If you can't see it because it's above on top, I just drag it down, and my little trick is I just put it over there. I look to see what my input is. It's 89, and then I just drag it back up to the top and I move it until I see 89%. And let's look. Before, after. Alright, big difference right off of the bat. You can see the difference. Okay, so that alone is good. And at this point we have a pretty good image. Now we could maybe try to push my blacks a little bit more, try to get some more contrast here. That looks a little bit better. But now we get to the sliders, radius and threshold. Radius is going to start to bring out some detail. You can see here as I start to bump this radius setting up here. Let's bring our threshold up. See what happens? It's kind of like radius and threshold with unsharp mask. Alright, the higher I go, you're going to start to see some haloing. Let me see if I can zoom in for you here. Okay, the higher I go, things are going to start to get halo-y. Alright, almost kind of fake looking, almost kind of like a fantasy image. Alright, so that's why you have to be careful, because I'm not crazy about the fantasy looking HDR. What I want is real world HDR. I want HDR that looks real. It looks real and it looks like it did when I was there, not that fantasy looking effect. So that's what I'm trying to achieve here. And then your threshold here, you're going to see down when it's down set low, you're not going to see any difference really here in radius. But when I start to bring this threshold up, you'll start to see some of that contrast really start to come in. Alright, and if I start to go too high with it, you're going to see one of the problems that we're going to have is you're going to see the result of that high radius even more. You're going to see that haloing and see the sky here? See what's happened? It's really started to blur and kind of just get weird. And that's why you got to be careful to kind of find the best of both worlds between the two. Alright, and that's why I usually don't go too crazy with them. Okay? Now at this point, we're going to hit OK. And when you're done with it, it's actually rendering the HDR image. Alright, and this is going to take us to a 16-bit regular image that we'd have inside of Photoshop, where we can do all the Photoshop things in the world that we want to it. Okay, so one of the first things that I do when it's done here, one of the first things that I do, and I'm not going to go through the whole Photoshop process, but I usually go to Image, Adjustments, down to Shadow Highlight, and if I could get my shadow highlight dialog box into the screen, you'd see it. But a lot of times you're going to see that the highlights come in a little way too bright, or the shadows come in way too bright, and then you can come in here and mess with the highlights. You've also got mid-tone contrast. That helps out. Alright, and again, you can go for that fantasy-like effect, or you can reel everything in and you can go for a more realistic effect. And in the HDR conversion, I think I already went probably too fantasy when it comes to what we see up here. But let's take a look. Before and after. So what we did is just bring out a little bit of detail inside of those shadow areas. So I'm going to hit OK. Now, at this point, that's Photoshop's merge to HDR. It looks okay, but if you're thinking, alright, that's nothing special, that's the problem with Photoshop's merge to HDR. It really is, it's not that great. And that's why I was always really disappointed with it. I tried this program called Photomatix Pro, and I'm a total HDR addict. Alright, so I'm going to bring up the link that I have for you here just so you can see it. But Photomatix Pro, I'm a total HDR addict, and again, I don't abuse HDR. I use it for my landscape photography. I use it for any type of product shots, interior photography, real estate photography, things that you can't capture well with one exposure. You'll be amazed at what HDR with Photomatix Pro will do. It just saves me time. I could take all the exposures that you saw here inside of Bridge. I could open these up into Photoshop. Alright, as long as you shoot it on a tripod, that's the other thing. I could open this up into Photoshop, and I could start to mask things together and try to get the window and the highlights and the shadows and everything good. It just takes a lot of time. And what I found with Photomatix Pro is that I get awesome results in really just a matter of seconds. It's a wonderful thing. But That's it. I did want to show you the Photoshop way. Now let me show you the bracketing tutorial I got here, allthingsphotography.com, and that's allthingsphotography, that's hyphenated each word, and then /bracketing.html. And this shows you about bracketing, exposure bracketing on your camera, what it is, how, why. And then what you can do is go to your camera's manual, whether you're Canon or Nikon, they each have bracketing features that you can turn on, and it will take the different exposures for you and set everything where you don't have to do it manually. So you'll definitely want to go check that out. Alright, so make sure you read the tutorial. You've got the sample files. If you own Photoshop CS2 or CS3, these sample files come inside that samples folder, so you can practice and follow along. And then make sure you check out the next week's video, where I'll do merge to HDR, but this time I'm going to use that program called Photomatix Pro, and I'll show you where the differences are, and I'll show you kind of where I think that one really shines.